I looked around and saw nothing but emptiness. The land, once rich with life, was now a barren wasteland. The earth was cracked and dry, as if it had given up hope. There was no sign of growth, no green, only ashen soil that seemed to stretch endlessly. The trees, once full of life, stood like skeletons, their branches twisted and devoid of leaves. It was as if the land itself had died, unable to bear the weight of the suffering it had witnessed. And then I saw them, the people. They were everywhere, their figures stumbling like shadows across the broken earth. Their faces were gaunt, hollowed by hunger. Their clothes were ragged, barely hanging on their bodies. The once vibrant colors of their clothes were now reduced to faded rags. I could see their ribs, their bodies nothing more than frames, each one a testament to the hunger that had claimed them. A mother clutched her child, whose eyes were too weak to even cry. The boy was too tired, too hungry, to make a sound. The scene was surreal, haunting. People who had once been full of life now walked like ghosts, moving aimlessly through a world that had left them behind. A man knelt in the dirt, clawing at the ground, desperate for something, anything to eat. His hands scraped at the earth with a frantic energy, but there was nothing there. The earth was barren, and so were they. I watched as a boy, no older than 6, collapsed beside a dry riverbed. His mother, frantic, shook him, whispering something I couldn't hear. She reached into her bag and pulled out a single shriveled potato. Her hands trembled as she broke off a piece the size of a pebble and placed it into his mouth. But it wasn't enough. The boy's eyes closed, his body limp in his mother's arms. The woman's cry echoed through the silence, sharp and raw. It wasn't just a cry of sorrow, it was a cry of devastation, of hopelessness. The world had failed them. We had failed them. I felt the weight of that truth pressing on my chest as I turned away, unable to bear the sight any longer. But then something caught my eye. A group of people huddled around a fire. But they weren't cooking food. They were burning scraps of fabric and paper for warmth. Their faces were hollow, their eyes sunken. One of them held an empty can, scraping at the inside with a spoon, as if hoping to find just one more bite, just one last morsel to stave off the hunger. It was a sight of desperation, of humanity stripped bare. And in that moment, I knew, I understood what I was seeing. This wasn't just a famine. This was the result of years, decades, of waste, greed, gluttony. We had squandered everything. All that we had been given, resources, abundance, opportunity, and now it was all gone. We were facing the consequences of choices we had made long before this catastrophe. Choices that seemed insignificant at the time. After all, who had ever thought twice about throwing away a half-eaten sandwich? Or the fries we didn't finish? Or the snacks we took but never ate? I hadn't thought about it. I hadn't cared. Growing up, food had always been there. The pantry was full. The fridge was packed with leftovers. If I didn't like what we had at home, I could order takeout. Food was everywhere, at parties, at school events, even in the trash. I used to laugh with my friends as we scraped uneaten pizza into the garbage, thinking it was no big deal. But now, as I stood in this desolate wasteland, the reality hit me like a punch to the gut. We had taken everything for granted. I had never stopped to think about those who didn't have enough to eat, the families who would have given anything for the scraps we discarded. I had never thought about how much energy, water and effort it took to grow the food, to raise the animals, to package the products. All of that had been treated like garbage, discarded without a second thought. And now, standing in the midst of this chaos, I saw the result of that waste. It wasn't just the earth that had suffered. We had all suffered. As I stood there, my heart racing, I felt a presence beside me. I turned, and there he was, Jesus. His expression was steady, but his eyes were filled with sorrow. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His gaze told me everything. This was the result of our choices. This was what happens when we waste what we've been given. Tears welled up in my eyes as the reality of it all settled in. I had been blind. We had all been blind. We had been given so much to be grateful for, and we had squandered it all. The food, the resources, the time. It had all been taken for granted, and now there was nothing left. The land was empty, the people were empty, and we were left to face the consequences of our actions. The air shifted, and suddenly I was no longer standing in that barren wasteland. The world around me transformed, and I found myself standing in the middle of a grand banquet hall, the type of place you would expect to find in a palace or perhaps a mansion. The tables stretched endlessly before me, covered with food, turkeys, hams, fruits, desserts, and dishes I couldn't even name. The scene was breathtaking at first, the aroma of freshly baked bread and roasted meat filling the air, making my stomach rumble. This was abundance. This was everything that the people in the wasteland had been starving for. But something wasn't right. At first the scene seemed joyful. People were laughing and eating, piling their plates high with food. But as I looked closer, I began to notice the waste. Plates, half full, were pushed aside and replaced by new ones, as though the food didn't even matter. Servants were dumping untouched dishes into bins, making room for more. Children were playing with their food, throwing chunks of bread at one another, laughing, unaware of the preciousness of what they had. A man took one bite of a turkey leg, only to toss it onto the floor, as if it had lost all value after a single bite. It wasn't a feast, it was gluttony. The scene before me was not one of appreciation, but of excess and indulgence. As I stood there, watching this display of reckless consumption, I felt a deep pit of discomfort in my stomach. This wasn't the way food was meant to be treated. This wasn't the way we were supposed to live. Suddenly, the scene shifted again. I was no longer standing in the grand banquet hall. I found myself standing in the middle of a landfill. Mountains of food waste stretched as far as the eye could see, rotting in the hot sun. The smell was overwhelming, thick and nauseating. Flies buzzed around, landing on the discarded remains of what had once been meals. I saw piles of perfectly good bread, fruits with only minor bruises, and unopened cans of soup, all discarded without a second thought. Food that could have fed the hungry was now nothing more than waste, thrown away like it had no worth. And then I saw them, the people beyond the landfill. Families, their faces hollow with hunger, stood in line. A mother reached into the trash, pulling out a moldy loaf of bread. She wiped it off with her sleeve, broke it in half, and handed it to her children. Nearby, a man fought a dog over a piece of meat. His desperation was raw and unfiltered. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the hopelessness of it all hung in the air like a heavy fog. The banquet hall and the landfill, they weren't separate. They were two sides of the same coin. The wasteful indulgence of the banquet hall had led to the suffering and starvation of those in the landfill. And as I looked around, I realized the truth. This was no accident. This was the result of our choices, of the way we treated the resources that had been given to us. It was a vicious cycle of excess and neglect. I turned to Jesus, my chest tight with shame. He didn't speak, but I could feel his presence pressing on my heart. This is what happens when you value excess over gratitude, I understood. This is what happens when you take more than you need, without regard for those who have nothing. We had been given so much, yet we had wasted it all. And now, the world was paying the price. The landfill before me began to dissolve, and I was no longer surrounded by mountains of waste. I found myself standing in the middle of a lush field. The air smelled fresh, and the land felt alive, full of potential. Rows of crops stretched out before me, corn, wheat, and vegetables, all thriving under the bright sun. But as I watched, the scene began to change. Machines rolled into the fields, their engines roaring. They tore through the crops at a speed that felt more like destruction than gathering. The soil churned beneath their weight, the earth groaning as it was stripped bare. The crops were loaded into trucks and sent to factories where they were processed, packaged, and shipped around the world. But instead of feeding the hungry, much of it ended up in warehouses, rotting on shelves or dumped in garbage dumps, discarded before it could be used. The waste wasn't just in the landfill, it was everywhere. It was in the way we treated the land, the way we consumed without thought, without care for the consequences. I followed the path of the crops, and soon I found myself on the deck of a fishing boat. Nets plunged into the water, dragging up thousands of fish at a time. The workers sorted through the catch, tossing some into bins while throwing the rest, perfectly good fish, back into the ocean, dead. The sea, vast and endless, was beginning to empty. Beneath the surface, there was nothing. The waters were silent. The oceans that had once teemed with life were now empty. We had taken everything, without thought of tomorrow. I felt a pang of sorrow as I watched. We weren't just taking what we needed, we were taking everything. The world was being drained of its resources, and we were too blind to see the consequences. This wasn't just about food. It was about the way we lived, the choices we made, and the values we had lost. We were treating the earth as though it was infinite, as though we could take without end. But it wasn't. The scene shifted again, and I found myself standing before massive factories and processing plants. Chemicals poured into rivers, poisoning the water. Forests were leveled to make way for more farmland, more factories, more cities. The air grew thick with smoke. The ground cracked and dried beneath the weight of human greed. It was the same story everywhere. The earth was being stripped bare, and we were too busy to notice. And then it all stopped. The fields that had once been green were now brown and barren. The oceans, once teeming with life, were silent. The factories shut down, their machines idle. Trucks sat empty, unable to deliver goods that no longer existed. The world had run out of resources, and the people were left with nothing. The world I was seeing, this empty and broken world, suddenly dissolved, and I found myself standing in the middle of a vast, desolate city. It wasn't a city I recognized. The buildings were crumbling, their windows shattered, their walls covered in soot. Smoke hung thick in the air, choking the atmosphere, as fires burned in the distance. The streets were eerily silent, save for the occasional sound of distant footsteps or the crackle of flames. It wasn't the quiet of peace. It was the oppressive silence of a world holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable end. As I walked through the ruins, I could feel the weight of the destruction pressing down on me. I saw families huddled in corners, their faces gaunt with hunger. A woman clutched a bundle of rags to her chest, her body trembling as she shuffled down the street. A man crouched beside a trash can, digging through the ashes, searching for something, anything, edible. The desperation in their eyes, the raw fear in their movements, it all felt suffocating. The city was broken, just like the world around it. The people had no hope left, but the images didn't stop there. As I walked through the city, I witnessed things that will forever be etched in my mind, things that no one should ever have to see. A family, their bodies thin and frail, tearing apart a rat they had caught, their hands shaking as they devoured it raw. I watched in horror as a group of people fought over a single piece of bread. Their voices, once full of hope, had been reduced to screams. They fought with fists and knives, desperation turning them into animals. And then, in the shadows of a collapsed building, I saw something that made my stomach churn. A man sat alone, his face pale, his eyes darting nervously as he chewed on something that looked like a bundle of meat. My mind screamed in disbelief, but deep down I knew exactly what it was. This wasn't survival. This was something far darker. This was the result of a world that had lost its soul, a world that had consumed itself, until there was nothing left but hunger. I turned to Jesus, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing with questions. How had it come to this? How had we fallen so far? He didn't speak. His presence, though, was enough to silence my thoughts. He didn't need words to convey the message. I could feel it in the very air, the pain, the sorrow, the sense of inevitability. This is what happens when you worship your own desires. This is what happens when you place your needs above everything else. It wasn't just hunger that had driven these people to such darkness. It was selfishness. It was greed. It was the refusal to care for others. The world, once vibrant and full of life, had been reduced to this, an empty shell of what it once was. The famine I had witnessed earlier wasn't just about food. It was a spiritual famine, a hunger for something deeper, something that couldn't be satisfied with material possessions or fleeting pleasures. I was taken to a small apartment in the middle of the crumbling city. Its windows were boarded up, the air thick with rot. Inside, a mother and her son sat on the floor. Their faces were pale, their bodies thin, their clothes barely hanging onto their frail frames. The boy cried softly, clutching his stomach, his body racked with hunger. The mother, desperate to comfort him, tried to calm him with soothing words, but it was clear that there was nothing she could do. There was nothing left to give. On the stove, a pot simmered, its contents unrecognizable. The mother stirred it with trembling hands, her eyes full of tears. She had nothing but that pot, that meager meal, and yet she held on to the hope that somehow she could feed her son. But it wasn't enough. It was never enough. This wasn't a famine caused by nature. This wasn't something that had come from the earth. This was a famine we had caused. We had built this world, this system, on the foundations of greed and excess, and now the consequences were laid bare before me. I stepped outside, and the city stretched on endlessly, filled with the same scenes of desperation and horror. There was no hope here, no light, no future. This was the tribulation, a world brought to its knees, not just by scarcity, but by the choices we had made long before. Jesus gestured toward the city, and I felt his message resonate deep within me. This is what you've sown, and this is what you'll reap. The famine wasn't just about food. It was about the spiritual famine that had taken hold of humanity. We were starving, not just for bread, but for meaning, for hope, for the presence of God in our lives. The world I was witnessing was a reflection of our own choices. It was the result of living a life without faith, without gratitude, without God. But as the city began to dissolve, the darkness faded, and I found myself in a different place. It wasn't grand or striking, like the other visions I had seen. It was simple. A small room, lit by a single candle. A family sat on the floor, 2 parents and their daughter, no older than 10. They huddled together, their faces thin but calm. The father tore a small loaf of bread into 3 pieces. The portions were tiny, barely enough to feed 1 person, let alone 3. But as they each took their share, they bowed their heads in prayer. It wasn't a rushed, obligatory prayer. It was deep, sincere. They thanked God, not just for the bread, but for his presence, for his provision, for his faithfulness. There was no resentment in their eyes, no bitterness about the small portions they had. They smiled at one another, talking softly, encouraging each other. It was a picture of peace, of contentment. And then, to my amazement, the father broke off a piece of his own bread and handed it to his daughter. "It's okay," he whispered. "You need it more." The girl hesitated, her eyes wide with gratitude and guilt, but the father's smile reassured her, and she ate. I turned to Jesus, my heart aching. How could this family have so little and yet so much? How could they be so peaceful, so joyful in the midst of such scarcity? I felt the weight of the lesson he was showing me. They weren't clinging to their bread or their circumstances. They were clinging to him. Jesus didn't speak, but his presence was overwhelming. "This is what it means to trust me," he was saying. "This is what it means to live in faith." I thought back to the scenes I had witnessed earlier, the greed, the waste, the desperation, the people who had worshipped their desires, their wealth, their power. And when those things were taken away, they were left with nothing. But this family, they had placed their trust in something eternal. Even in their poverty, they were rich. They had nothing, but they had everything. As I stood there, watching the family share their last morsel of food, my mind was flooded with questions. How could they be so joyful, so at peace in the face of such scarcity? How could they have so little and yet give so much? The answer, I realized, wasn't in what they had or didn't have. It was in their trust, their faith. They weren't clinging to the material world. They weren't defined by what they owned or the comforts they had. They had placed their faith in God. They had nothing but his provision. And yet, they were rich in a way I had never understood before. The image of the family stayed with me, even as the scene shifted once more. The warm, simple room faded, and I found myself standing in a vast, empty space. The ground beneath me was cracked and dry. the air thick with an overwhelming silence. And then I saw him again. Jesus stood a few steps away, his expression solemn but filled with compassion. I didn't need to hear his voice. His presence, his gaze, spoke louder than any words ever could. I knew what he was asking. "What will you choose?" The question echoed in my mind, reverberating through my soul. I could feel the weight of it. This was the moment of truth. The images began to flash around me, rapid and unrelenting. I saw moments of abundance, meals wasted, resources squandered, landfills overflowing with food that could have fed the hungry. I saw oceans emptied of fish, fields stripped of crops, and communities torn apart by greed and neglect. The world was unraveling under the weight of its own excess, and I saw it all. Every single choice, every action, every moment of waste that had led to this point. I saw myself, my own moments of waste, scraping leftovers into the trash because I wasn't in the mood to eat them, ordering more food than I could possibly consume simply because it was there, ignoring the needs of others, too focused on my own comfort to care about the bigger picture. The images of my own wastefulness hit me like a punch to the gut. I had been part of the problem. The vision shifted again, showing a world consumed by excess, where people fought over scraps, where cities crumbled and fields turned to dust. But then something changed. I saw glimpses of hope, small acts of kindness, people sharing their food, opening their homes, choosing simplicity over excess. I saw communities coming together, not out of abundance, but out of faith. The world wasn't beyond saving. If we could change, if we could repent, if we could shift our hearts, we could stop the collapse before it was too late. But that required a choice to change, a choice to stop living in excess and start living with purpose, a choice to value what we had been given, to live with gratitude and generosity instead of greed and waste. The images began to fade, and I saw a simple wooden cross standing in the distance. It wasn't glowing or ornate, but its presence was undeniable. It filled the air with a quiet strength, a strength that made everything else feel insignificant. I knew then that the cross was the answer, not just for me, but for the world. It was a call to surrender, a call to let go of our greed, our selfishness, and to live the way Jesus had taught us, with humility, gratitude, and love. Tears filled my eyes as I realized the enormity of the choice before us. Would we continue down the path of waste and excess, clinging to things that could never satisfy? Or would we turn back to God, trusting Him to provide, even when it felt impossible? The choice was ours to make, and it was a choice that would shape the future of the world. I felt the weight of it all, the urgency, the responsibility, the possibility. It wasn't just about food or resources, it was about our hearts. The famine, the tribulation, the suffering, they weren't punishments. They were warnings. Warnings that we had strayed too far from the path. Warnings that we needed to turn back before it was too late. I turned to Jesus, my heart heavy with the realization of everything we had lost. He didn't say a word, but I felt his message clearly. The cross was the answer. The way forward was through surrender, through living with faith, through trusting that God would provide and that we didn't need to hold on to everything for ourselves. The choice was clear. We could choose greed and waste, or we could choose faith and gratitude. The vision began to fade, and I found myself back in the hospital room, the beeping of the machines pulling me back to reality. But the weight of what I had seen, the lessons I had learned, stayed with me. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to process everything. The golden feast, the overflowing landfills, the desperation of the starving, it all felt so vivid, so real. But above all, I couldn't shake the memory of Jesus' gaze, the way his eyes seemed to pierce through every excuse I had ever made. We had been given so much, and we had wasted it. As I lay there, the steady beep of the hospital machine seemed distant, almost irrelevant, compared to the weight of what I had just experienced. The vision, still vivid in my mind, continued to haunt me. The stark contrast between the wasteful banquet and the humble family sharing their last loaf of bread was burned into my memory. The images of greed, destruction, and gluttony blended with the quiet strength of faith, simplicity, and gratitude. It was a revelation, one that was both painful and profound. I could no longer look at the world the same way. The vision wasn't just a warning for me, it was a wake-up call for all of us. I had been living my life without thinking, taking what I had for granted, consuming more than I needed, and ignoring the needs of those around me. I had wasted food, time, resources, and energy without a second thought. But the vision showed me the consequences of that behavior, the famine that wasn't just about food, but about the emptiness we all face when we ignore what truly matters. It wasn't just the earth that was suffering, it was our souls too. The message was clear. The time for change had come. We couldn't keep living the way we had been, wasting everything in sight while others went hungry. We couldn't keep thinking that our actions didn't matter, that our choices were insignificant. Every meal we wasted, every resource we took for granted, every moment we spent in excess instead of gratitude, it was all part of the problem. The world we were seeing in the vision was a reflection of our own choices, our own blindness. But there was hope. The family in the candlelit room had shown me that. They had so little, yet they had so much, because they lived with faith, trust, and gratitude. They didn't cling to their possessions or their comfort. They understood that what mattered most wasn't what they had, but who they trusted. They lived by the simple truth that everything we have is a gift, and we are called to use it wisely, to share it, and to be grateful for it. I couldn't ignore that lesson. I couldn't pretend that I hadn't seen what I had seen. I couldn't go back to living the same way I had before, throwing away food, wasting time, ignoring the needs of others. The vision had opened my eyes to the reality of our world, the way we treat each other, the way we treat the earth, and the way we treat God's gifts. It wasn't just about food. It was about how we live our lives, our choices, our priorities, our hearts. We have been given so much, and yet we squander it, not realizing the consequences. But we can change. It's not too late. The famine I saw in the vision, the world crumbling under the weight of its own excess, it didn't have to be the end. We can choose to live differently. We can choose to live with gratitude, with faith, with a deep awareness of the responsibility we have to care for what we've been given. The question now isn't whether we can change. The question is, will we? Will we stop wasting, stop hoarding, and start living with intention? Will we turn back to God, trusting Him to provide, and choosing to live with humility and generosity? We can't keep living as if there are no consequences. The famine, the real famine, is happening right now, not just in the world around us, but in our hearts. The emptiness we feel when we chase after things that will never satisfy, that's the spiritual famine that we need to address. And as I lay in that hospital bed, I realized that it all starts with us. It starts with the choices we make every day. It starts with how we treat the earth, how we treat each other, and how we treat the resources God has given us. We can no longer afford to be blind to the needs of the world. We can no longer afford to waste. Every act of generosity, every moment of gratitude, every choice to share what we have, these are the seeds that can heal the world. These are the steps we must take to restore balance, to restore hope. I remember the last words I heard in the vision, as the image of Jesus, standing with me in the barren wasteland, began to fade. This is what you've sown, and this is what you'll reap. His message was as clear as the earth beneath my feet. We are the ones responsible for the state of the world, through our waste, our greed, and our refusal to care for what we've been given. But we are also the ones who can change it. It's up to us. In that moment, I made a promise to myself. I would no longer live the same way. I would no longer waste. I would no longer consume without thought. I would live with intention, with gratitude, and with a heart full of faith. I would care for the earth, care for others, and trust that God would provide. The vision may have ended, but its message remained in my heart. The world may be facing a famine, but it doesn't have to be the end. We have the power to change, and it starts with each one of us.